Chapter 045 Fine Structures. Zorian was starting to realize he didn't understand Taven nearly as well as he thought he did. And it wasn't just the surprising amount of insecurity that lurked behind her seemingly endless optimism and confidence that made him think that. It was also the amount of thought and consideration she put into his time loop situation. When he told her about his situation, she actually listened to him without interruption, and even took notes, and then later came back with a list of questions and ideas. This was very atypical behavior for her. Taven was pretty much a prime example of the less thinking, more action philosophy, and she even admitted that she still wasn't entirely convinced about the whole time loop thing, so he was rather baffled about her motives and thought processes. Still, while the list she had made with Kale's help was kind of surprising, it contained nothing particularly revolutionary, and all of the points could be boiled down to 4 basic questions. Why didn't he get help from more people around him than her and Kale? Why didn't he tell the government or academy authorities what was going on and get their cooperation? Why was he pursuing so many magical fields instead of properly focusing on them, one at a time? And lastly, why didn't he try harder to develop his combat magic? Zorian found the last one especially amusing. It was only a few days ago, after all, that Taven was breaking down into tears over his incredible combat skills, yet now she was saying he should have put more effort into them. You just couldn't satisfy some people. Alas, Taven didn't find her complete turnaround of opinion nearly as amusing as he did. Zorian's logic for putting combat magic practice squarely in the secondary goal pile, namely, that very few of his problems could be solved through direct violence and that he just wasn't terribly suited for combat magic in the first place, had been summarily rejected by Taven, who decreed that she would be helping to bring him up to snuff in that regard. Through sparring. Constant, daily, dangerously serious sparring. He'd apparently had no idea what he was getting into when he decided to go along with her idea, because there was a huge difference between sparring with Taven when she thought he was just a precocious amateur with a couple of tricks and sparring with her when she considered him a serious threat right from the start and wasn't afraid of hurting him. She was vicious and merciless, and he was honestly afraid she would end up killing him if he didn't give it his all, despite all the safety wards embedded into her family's training hall. It was just a bit too intense for his liking. Maybe she was still a little bitter about him improving so much in so short a time. "Are you ready?" she asked him, twirling her combat staff playfully in her hands. "No?" Zorian tried. He'd just finished another frustrating session with Xveen, and didn't get to rest at all before coming over to Taven's place. The last thing he wanted to do right now was get smacked around in the name of training. "Too bad," Taven snorted derisively. "We're starting. Go." Yeah, he didn't think that would actually get him anywhere. He immediately threw himself to the side, dodging her opening shot. Which wasn't a magic missile or anything reasonable like that. No, she opened the battle with a powerful beam of force. Force Lance, as the spell was called, was her new favorite when fighting him. He knew better than to try to shield against it this time. The beam was practically designed for cracking simple force barriers, focusing an immense amount of penetrating force on a tiny patch of the shielding surface. Some of the stronger, more advanced shields could withstand the beam, but nothing in Zorian's arsenal could truly stand up to it. He had learned that lesson very painfully in the first few spars he'd had with Taven during the past few days, and he still had bruises all over his chest and arms to prove it. Even at their highest setting, the safety wards couldn't blunt the power of the spear-like beam completely. No, the only realistic defense he had against that spell was moving out of its way. The good news was that beam spells like those couldn't home in on targets, so dodging them was an option. The bad news was that a beam traveled blindingly fast and was really hard to evade at the distances he and Taven fought at. Plus, he kind of sucked at dodging. The last few days had forced him to learn quickly, though, and in this particular case he was fast enough to move out of the beam's path. He responded immediately with a gust of wind, trying to knock her off balance and possibly blind her. Sadly, this was not the first time he had tried that, and she simply countered it with a weather shield before throwing a fully powered fireball at him. Gods, she really wasn't playing around, was she? He fired off a dispelling wave to negate it, since the alternative would be to tank it with a much more expensive Aegis. Besides, cost concerns aside, the spherical shield would leave him immobile while in place, and Tivan would be sure to capitalize on that. A force lance that quickly followed the fireball told him that this was indeed her likely plan. If he had stood still and tried to tank the fireball, the force lance would have caught him flat-footed. He threw a small swarm of magic missiles at her, all of them on a very direct trajectory towards her. They were just bait, really, intended to take advantage of a certain predictable maneuver Taven liked to do, where she countered such attacks by firing a massive battering ram of force that not only swept the attack aside, but also acted as a counter-attack at the same time. That's why he immediately followed up his barrage with a ray of electricity, which would be completely unaffected by her blast of force. He guessed her response well this time. She had tried to respond with a force battering ram, but then caught onto his plan halfway through and dodged the beam he'd sent at her. As for himself, he used the disturbance in her attack rhythm to initiate a short-distance teleport, transporting himself behind her back. She noticed him, of course. She was probably using the mana-sensing trick she had taught him so long ago, but she could do little else but raise a hasty Aegis to shield herself against the blast of force he had sent at her. He followed this up with a force lance, intending to give her a taste of her own medicine, but she expertly dodged it and sent an 8-missile swarm at him, forcing him to fire another dispelling wave to deal with them. He kind of wondered why she still kept bunching up her projectile swarms together like that when she already knew that allowed him to take them all out with a single counterspell. Maybe she couldn't. He knew he had better shaping skills than her, so maybe that kind of fine control over one's projectiles was beyond her. He teleported again to evade another battering ram of force and then sent his own missile swarm at her, each missile following its own exotic trajectory to make them hard to track and take out. The battle raged like that for another couple of minutes, before Zorian was forced to concede defeat due to running out of mana. It was a good fight in his opinion, if nothing else because he didn't get any new bruises this time around. Taven complained, of course, lecturing him about pacing himself better, but the simple truth was that she was driving him way too hard for him to be conservative with his mana use. He would rather be too frivolous with his mana use and lose due to exhausting himself than end up on the receiving end of an offensive spell again. You know, running out of mana like that in a real battle basically means you die, Taven said. And getting speared through the lung by a force lance doesn't? Zorian countered. She stared at him. Okay, yeah, you got me there. She walked over to a nearby bench and motioned him to sit beside her. Have you thought about that list Kale gave you? She asked. Of course he had. He even discussed with her some of the points she had brought up over the past few days, although he suspected she didn't like his answers all that much. Interpreting her question as a demand for a more long-winded, comprehensive explanation, he started telling her about the reasoning behind his decisions. His reasons for not getting help from more people, and especially official authorities of any sort, were simple to explain. The more people he told about the time loop, the greater the chance that they would let something slip to the wrong person and lead Red Robe back to him. Unless they hit something he really needed, and which he simply couldn't get by any other way, it was best to keep them ignorant of the time loop. Truthfully, even telling Taven was probably a pointless risk. He told her about the time loop for the same reason he kept taking Cariel with him to Sioria. Despite his little sister being nothing but a huge liability and time sink, he wanted someone familiar to talk and confide to. He kept his mouth shut about that last detail in his explanation to Taven, though he doubted she would appreciate hearing that. Instead he focused on the fact that virtually no one would be willing to believe him about being a time traveler, and that convincing them would probably take weeks and could easily cause quite a stir. This was especially true in regards to her ideas about contacting the city government or academy authorities. Zack had already tried to notify them about the time loop and had never been taken seriously. There was no reason to think Zorian would be any more successful at it than Zack was. Didn't you say Zack is kind of an idiot? Taven asked curiously. Sort of, said Zorian. But in this case, I think he's far more suited to the task than I am. There is no way I'd ever be as trustworthy to authority figures as Zack. Ah, yes, the natural mind magic thing, Taven said. Well, that too, but I was actually thinking about how I'd probably never be as forthright and honest about things as Zack probably was, he admitted. I'd hide things and people would notice and be wary of me as a result. Taven gave him a long, searching look. You're not even telling me everything, are you? I'm telling you most things, he said. Everything I think is relevant. She stayed silent and gave him an annoyed look. Anyway, he said quickly, looking to change the subject, even ignoring that, contacting Sioria's authorities is a particularly bad idea because there is obviously someone high in the administration that is cooperating with the invaders. I'm almost certain by now that whoever is leading the cult of the World Dragon also has a high position in the city government. It would explain why the members of the cult keep getting lucrative contracts from the city and exemptions from all sorts of normal regulations, and it would make sense for Ibisons to also have someone in their pocket. I keep forgetting that part, Taven admitted. Which is pretty bizarre, now that I think about it. Finding out that some crazy cult has thoroughly infiltrated our city government is honestly one of the scariest parts of your story, but the part where I'll apparently get erased out of existence at the end of this month sort of drowns out everything else. Ouch. She was still fixated on that. He did his best to move the conversation along, tackling her concerns about spreading himself thin next. Her complaints that it would be better for him if he picked one or two things to really focus on held merit. Unfortunately, there was a reason why he was not doing that. He kept encountering various emergencies during his time in the time loop, which forced him to often drop topics or push them into the background to accommodate the newest priority that just sprung up on him. The second issue basically amounted to personal weakness. He could only focus on something for so long before he got thoroughly sick of it and had to do something else. Since he aimed to be a generalist mage anyway, he didn't think of this as some huge issue he had to work on, but he understood why a tightly focused spellcaster like Taven would be annoyed with him for that. As for not trying harder at combat magic, well, we already discussed that topic enough, I think. You already know my opinion on the matter, he told her. Yet you keep coming to these spars anyway, she noted. I know I was kind of pushy about it, but it's not like I can really make you come if you decided to put your foot down. Well, I do want to get better at it, he shrugged. No reason to refuse free practice. I just wish you would tone it down a little. Oh, come on. What are you afraid of? Taven scoffed. Aren't you a big, bad time traveler that can't really die? Treating death as a nuisance could easily become a habit that would kill me for real once I'm out of the time loop. Unless there is a pressing need for it, or some downright amazing opportunity, I'd like to avoid dying too much, Zorian said. Also, you do realize that the time loop only resets when Zack dies, not when I do? If you end up killing me, you'll have to live with the consequences till the end of the month. The look she gave him told him that no, she did not realize that. Yup, that was more like the Taven he knew. She mumbled something about sensitive little flowers and then leaned back on the cold wall behind them. Rather unhealthy, that. You know, you don't have to rely on me to help her with combat magic, she said. There are quite a few combat magic instructors in Sioria. With the amount of money you have at your disposal and the ability to keep spending it over and over again, you could get instruction from all of them. Combat magic may not be a priority for you, but keep that in mind. This is a killer opportunity, and you will never get anything like it outside of your time loop. Zorian frowned. What do you mean? A lot of mages simply won't teach you if they know you've been taught by their rival or competitor, she told him. As in, they'll refuse out of principle. There is quite a bit of difference in teaching your personal tricks to some young mage who is just starting out and teaching them to this extremely talented guy who has absorbed the teachings of several veteran mages. Hell, some mages won't want to have anything to do with you if you seem too competent, period. They don't want to create a competitor that will overshadow them and steal lucrative opportunities from them in the future. No offense, Taven, but Damon never had any trouble securing powerful teachers, Zorian said. If anything, The number of people who wanted to mentor him increased as his talent became known to people. "I don't doubt it," she said. "But I guarantee that some doors also became closed to him at the same time. For you, that doesn't have to be the case. Not only will prospective teachers never know who else taught you in the past or how good you really are, you can also do things like sign apprenticeship contracts without them really binding you to anything. Hell, you could accept some really shitty deals if it meant getting some of the really deep secrets people have. Just think about it, okay?" "I am thinking about it. I've been thinking about that sort of thing since the start of the time loop. It's just that more pressing issues keep cropping up and eating into my time," he said. "I'm surprised you're bringing that up, though. Doesn't that bother you? I mean, we're basically talking about weaseling out the secrets that these people have spent their life gathering without compensating them in any way." "Well, yes," she said. "But realistically speaking, I'd do it in a heartbeat if I was in your place. And frankly, so would 9/10 of those same experts you're feeling sorry for. Are you seriously telling me you haven't been doing something like that all this time?" "Sometimes," Zorian said. Ilsa stood prominently in his mind, since he'd flat out become her apprentice to get her to teach him some of her stuff. "But I have been keeping a mental list of people I owed in this way, and I was thinking of doing something for them once I get out of the time loop. It's already quite a long list, though, and I don't know whether I can even do anything for some of them." "Ugh," she grunted, looking away uncomfortably. "What?" he asked. "You're a really weird guy, Zorian," she complained. "You can be such a selfish jerk at times, and then you say stuff like that and I realize I don't understand you at all." "The feeling is mutual, Taven," he told her with a smile. "What, that you think I'm a selfish jerk or that you don't understand me either?" she asked. "Both," he said. "Man, she really walked into that one." She made an outraged sound and gave him a light shove. "You're violent, too," he added. "Whatever," she said, getting up from the bench. "I'll bring Grunt and Mumble to our next spar so you can have some variety. I think I can also call in a few favors from my former classmates who also went for combat-related careers and have them fight you a few times as well. Your spellcasting is technically flawless, but you need better combat reflexes." Zorian gave her a curious look. "Why are you being so proactive about this?" he asked her. "I know you hate me bringing it up, but it was only a few days ago that you hated the idea of me surpassing you in your own field. Why did you change your attitude so drastically? You don't even fully believe in the time loop story, according to your own admission." "Because your life is on the line," she told him seriously. "That's the most important thing I got from your explanation. If it weren't for that, well, I'd be hell of a lot more jealous and bitter about all this. But it's not just an advantage, you have a heavy responsibility on your shoulders, and someone is trying to get you killed. In light of the chance that you might not make it out of this alive, all of my frustrations seem so petty in comparison." Huh? Was that why she was so insistent he needed to work more on his combat skills? "Don't die, okay?" she said when he didn't say anything for a while. "You're the best friend I have." Zorian fidgeted uncomfortably, unused to that kind of confession and mystified as to how he should respond to it. The snide, cynical part of him felt it was a pretty sad admission. He hadn't exactly been a nice person in his pre-loop days, and he had nursed a grudge against her ever since she'd laughed at his love confession. If the invasion in the time loop had never happened, would he have gotten over that in time to salvage their friendship? Or would he have continued to push her away until she eventually gave up on him, completely unaware that she apparently considered him her best friend? "I'll try not to," he eventually told her. He couldn't promise anything. Telling her that he would definitely live and that she had no cause for concern would be a lie, and they'd both know it. "Say, Taven, did you put some thought into how we can make this time loop work to your benefit? You know, like Kale did for his alchemy?" "Well, no," she said, shaking her head sadly. "It's useless, isn't it? Practicing combat magic requires shaping skills and routines that cannot be transferred via written notes. What could either of us possibly do to help the other, Taven?" I could teach you various shaping exercises and note which ones work best for you, though, Zorian said. I could show you the different combat spells I found over the restarts and note which ones you handle the best and what the most effective way of training you in them is. Kirill's magic lessons are at least 2 times more effective now than they were when I first tried to teach her, so it should be utterly trivial to create a training program that would let you grow twice as fast as you would without it. Just how much stuff do you think you can cram in 1 month? Taven asked skeptically. We won't know till we try it, will we? Zorian countered. And besides, there is no reason why the final training plan has to be limited to a month. Does every single new thing you learn necessarily build atop things you already mastered? No? There you go. That means we can break down a training plan into month-long chunks and optimize them separately. We can get at least a year that way, especially if you branch out in some necessary support skills that you've been ignoring. Your lack of divination skills is really felt in any restart where I decide not to join you, for instance. Taven looked torn. She was clearly excited about the idea, but at the same time she felt guilty about it. I don't know, she said. That sounds really time-consuming, and you don't really get anything out of it. You said yourself that you already have too many things vying for your attention. She was right, of course. Still, he owed her something for all the help she had given him in the past, and this seemed like a perfect way to pay her back. He would find the time if he could. Maybe not a lot of time, but still. I was going to look into combat magic-related shaping exercises anyway, he said. It might actually be a better idea to go through those together with you than to study them alone. You would know which ones are more useful better than I would. And besides, who says I have to hover around you all the time? I'm sure you can do a lot of testing yourself and then write a notebook for me to transfer into the next restart like Kayla's doing. Or just tell me what you found out face-to-face before the summer festival. It didn't take much convincing before Taven was fully on board with the idea. In a way, this was what she had asked of him back when she lost her composure, to show her how to cheat, too. He promised to bring an initial batch of spells and shaping exercises tomorrow on their next spar and then left to take care of other obligations. He wondered how long it would take for her to realize that she had agreed to spend day after day doing shaping exercises. He'd have to practice his Xvim impersonation for tomorrow. Break. In the ruins of the Iranian settlement beneath Sioria, Zorian patiently waited for Memory of Sublime Glories to finish memory probing the Ebeson mage he had captured and brought to her for interrogation. He had ventured deep into Invader held underground to retrieve this man, and was fortunate to stumble upon one of the middle-ranked leaders of the invasion force, so he had high hopes for the result of Sublime Glory's memory dive. In the meantime, he kept floating above the cavern floor not far from the Arania and her victim, holding himself aloft with the personal levitation exercise. In his left hand he held one of several small stones, which he kept disintegrating into dust in similarly non-structured manner. He had mastered both shaping exercises a long time ago, but the mild disruption effects present this far underground made them mildly challenging and thus a nice way to pass the time. He was starting to run out of rocks when the Arania finally withdrew from the invader's mind and approached him. Obviously, he had not told Memory of Sublime Glories anything about time travel, so he was not surprised that her report didn't mention anything remotely related to that. Still, she found out plenty of things of interest. The Ebesons are scared of you, Memory of Sublime Glories said. Well, not you personally, but the human nations on this continent are a source of constant worry for them. The technological revolution you are undergoing has not taken root on their island, and they fear they will gradually become powerless and irrelevant as time goes by. Since your nations have recently gone through several rounds of self-destructive wars and a deadly epidemic, and are at their most disunited in a long while, a lot of Ebesons feel that the time to strike at you is now. There has been a lot of agitation to launch some kind of invasion, but apparently there is also an influential faction that thinks such an invasion would be utter suicide and advocates trying to reopen diplomatic links to the continent. In light of that, this attack seems to have two main goals. The first is to make this nation look weak to others, thereby making any potential invasion by Alquanabasa look more attractive to their less warlike kin back home. Such a perception of weakness could also possibly ignite another continental war that would weaken everyone on the continent further. The second goal is to destroy any chance of official peace between Alquanabasa and Eldamar, thereby making the position of the reconciliation faction untenable. They are not scared that Eldamar might respond to the attack by outright invading Alquanabasa? Zorian asked. Alquanabasa is remote and inhospitable, and Eldamar has continental rivals to worry about, Memory of Sublime Glories said. They expect a response, but nothing substantial. A series of raids at most. Zorian wasn't so sure about that. Eldamar had been prospering for some time now, and the government was quite proud and aggressive. He wouldn't put it past the current royals and the Noble Council to launch a full-scale invasion of Alquanabasa out of sheer principle, costs be damned. Especially since the Ebusans were diplomatically isolated and not part of the Byzantine web of alliances that prevented the larger splinter states from simply attacking the smaller ones and absorbing them through force of arms. As the Ernia continued with her findings, however, it became obvious that the Ebusans had not simply relied on empty hope to discourage such an invasion. Sometime near the beginning of the month, just before the start of the time loop, the Ebusans had managed to overrun Fort Oriclo without alerting Eldamar that it had changed hands. Situated on a small island to the northeast of Eldamar and named after the general that had defeated Kotachichel's army at the conclusion of the Necromancer's War, Fort Oriclo was a small but important installation that served the dual purpose of being a monitoring station for keeping an eye on Alquanabasa and a supply base for Eldamar naval patrols. The Ebusans apparently called it Fort Dagger, because they considered it a knife pointed straight at their throat. So long as Eldamar held Fort Oriclo, they had a perfect staging ground for any raid or invasion on Alquanabasa. Before Eldamar could launch an attack on Alquanabasa, it first had to retake Fort Oriclo, a heavily warded fortress situated on an excellent defensive position. Some of this doesn't make any sense, Zorian complained. According to you, the Ebusans are transporting their forces straight from Alquanabasa to Fort Oriclo, then from Fort Oriclo to some unknown point in the Sarakian Highlands, and then from there to beneath Syria. Yes, what of it? That's not enough stops for an effective teleportation chain, Zorian said. Only 2 stop points for a journey of such distance, with the final destination point being deep underground to boot. There is no way that's really what's happening. If they were sending letters or small packages maybe, but no way could you transport an army like that. Even if Kotachichel is the best mass teleporter in the whole damn world, the mana costs for such long jumps would be completely impractical on that scale. Admittedly, such a small number of stops would do much to explain how they could transport such an army through Eldamar territory without being discovered by Eldamar, but they are not teleporting in the manner we've seen you do it, Memory of Sublime Glories noted. They're using some kind of stone construct to open a dimensional passage between 2 points. Like a door to another land. What? Can you describe that door in more detail, please? Zorian asked, frowning. Instead of answering with words, the Ernia promptly projected an image of said door that she pilfered from the man's mind straight into his mind. It wasn't a stone arch like he expected. Instead, it was a collection of stone bars arranged into a form of a large, skeletal icosahedron. Suspended in the middle of this bizarre geometric construct, like a window cut into the very earth itself, was the dimensional gate. It appeared circular at first glance, edges marked by a warped, blurry outline that looked as if someone had run a finger through a wet painting and smudged all the colors together. As the Ernia helpfully rotated the image, however, it became obvious that the gate looked circular no matter from which direction it was seen. It was spherical. Well, he supposed it answered some things. The gate spell was pretty much the pinnacle of dimensional magic, requiring both a lot of mana and extreme shaping skills to pull off successfully, but the invaders did have an ancient lich on their side. If anyone could casually open a gate, it would be Kotachichel. But they were inspired by ancient artifacts called Wakura gates, the Ernia added. Though unable to actually figure out how the Bakura gates work or how to activate them, they realize that the icosahedron thing around them is meant to stabilize the dimensional passage and make it last indefinitely. Or at least as long as you keep supplying it with enough mana. So they made their own version of it. Wait, you're saying that thing down there is constantly active? Zorian asked incredulously. According to our prisoner, yes, the Arania said. As far as he knows, the door is never shut down. Gods, a permanent dimensional passage like that. No wonder the invaders could bring such a huge force beneath the city and keep supplying it. He fired off a bunch of additional questions about how the knockoff Bakura gate was made, what its limitations were and so forth, but found that their captive had no idea of any of those things. Anyone except the leaders of the invasion was unlikely to know such things, and possibly no one except Kotachichel, who seemed to be in charge of maintaining the gates. Annoying. Still, the fact that the invasion was supplied by permanently active dimensional gates did provide certain opportunities. For instance, it meant that if he could capture the gates fast enough, he could get access straight into the heart of Ebisan operations, perhaps even Alquanabasa itself. Destroying the gate in their main base would no doubt utterly cripple the planned invasion, unless a new gate was easy to build, which he doubted. Finally, it opened the possibility of stealing the design from whoever made the thing, something he definitely wanted to do if it was at all possible. Hopefully the design wasn't exclusively held by Kotachichel or ran on children's souls or some such, because that was one amazing piece of magic. What about the research facility I've told you about? Zorian asked. Nothing that you don't already know, Memory of Sublime Glories told him. Frankly, I think you're going about this the wrong way. You say the previous Arania found out something important about that facility? Well, I don't think they did it by reading the minds of Ebisan invaders. Admittedly, I cannot tell that for certain without getting access to some of their leaders, but they seem to neither know nor care about what's down there. Except for the Lich, and as we both know, they'd never succeed in reading that thing's mind. Well, they clearly got information about it from someone, Zorian said. Yes, well, it is a government facility. It stands to reason that someone from the government knows what they do down there. Chances are that if you want to find out about the facility through the same methods that the previous web used, you are going to have to target whichever government official that facility is reporting to. That was a good point. He had no doubt that Spear of Resolve would attack a city official without the slightest bit of hesitation if she felt he had answers to her questions and she felt she could get away with it. And she could definitely get away with it, since she knew she was stuck in a time loop and none of the consequences would matter beyond a certain point. A valid point, but let's refrain from antagonizing the city government for now, he said. More than fine with me, the Arania responded. Having exhausted all of the topics Zorian could think of, they bid each other goodbye and agreed to meet the next day for his usual mind magic lessons. Weeks passed. And while he didn't make any incredible breakthroughs, his various projects kept slowly advancing forward. He absorbed everything about memory packet creation and reinforcement that Memory of Sublime Glories could teach him. He dutifully practiced what the other two filigree sages had to teach him. He scoured the Academy library for interesting shaping exercises for both himself and Taven. He built no less than 3 different golems with Edwin. And he learned a large number of spells from the books he and the filigree sages had found in the Iranian treasury. The most interesting of these new spells were a couple of highly illegal teleport variations that could punch through weaker teleport wards. If he could master those, he would get a major mobility boost within the city. Admittedly, it was possible that the city authorities could detect when someone was bypassing the city's teleport redirect in that fashion, but even if they could indeed do that, that would still make those spells incredibly useful during the actual invasion, when they'd be far too busy with other things to deal with him. Oh, and he also met with Rainey a couple of times. He was given a lot of information about the current political climate among shifter tribes and their history, which was kind of interesting but probably not really important for anything. The meetings were a nice distraction, though, so he didn't care that he wasn't really learning anything. So there is something I'm kind of curious about when it comes to shifter magic, Zorian said. I apologize in advance if I'm asking you to reveal some kind of tribal secret, but what exactly is the big advantage of being a shifter as opposed to just using a potion or a ritual to assume an animal form? I know that shifters can eschew material components that are otherwise needed to make a transformation shell, and that you can do a partial transformation to access the senses and other traits from your alternate forms, but that seems a little underwhelming, all things considered. Well, you have to remember that shifters originate from a different time, when other methods of transformation were far less developed and common than they are now, Rainey said. But there are some things you're missing. The shifter transformation is much faster and safer than anything you can cook up with your alchemy skills, and you automatically get instincts to go along with your new form. A normal mage that transforms into an animal will have big problems moving in their new body and even interpreting the animal's senses if they're too different from what humans are used to. A shifter can innately understand how their alternate form works, so it doesn't take much for bird shifters to learn how to fly as easily as birds, or for wolf shifters to actually understand what their enhanced noses are telling them. Ah, said Zorian in understanding, remembering how badly he flew while transformed into an eagle, even after spending several sessions practicing his flight. Yeah, that does sound like a major improvement over a transformation potion. There is also a stealth factor to consider, as your cat shifter friends can attest, Rainey continued. It's much easier to use transformation magics cleverly when you can transform at will, whenever you want, to what extent you want, with no strange movements and material aids required. And since we're on the topic of your feline friends, let me ask you something that I've been kind of curious about. Did you know all this stuff about shifters before you met the cat shifters, or did you only research the topic because you started hanging out with them? I'd known about shifters for a while by the time I met them, Zorian said. It was true, in a way. I was searching for help with something and came to Vanny for advice. He actually advised me to seek you out. Me? She asked incredulously. She frowned. Or do you mean shifters in general? Both. But he recommended you by name, Zorian said. Oh. She leaned forward in her seat, curious. And what exactly could I help you with? It doesn't matter, Zorian said, shaking his head. I've already gotten help elsewhere, and I've been told by others that you couldn't have helped me anyway. Oh come on, she huffed. That's just teasing. You can't just say something like that and then say it doesn't matter. Either you tell me or I send a letter to Vanny, asking him what he sent you to me for. Ugh. He didn't think she was serious, but if she was, that could easily lead to awkward questions about why Vanny doesn't remember ever talking to Zorian in the past. He really had to learn how to watch his tongue better. He was becoming as bad as Zack. It's very personal, so I'd appreciate if you leave the matter alone, okay? Zorian sighed. The short story is that I had the misfortune to end up on the receiving end of a necromantic spell and had a piece of foreign soul spliced with my own. I wanted answers as to what exactly happened to me, and Vanny suggested I approach your tribe for help. But since he had no idea how to actually find them, he named you as a possible contact. Ah, that's more serious than I thought, she said. I'm sorry, I pried. Are you? I'm fine, said Zorian, waving her off. Don't worry about it. I found a nice priest that helped me learn how to sense and protect my soul, so there should be no further incidents like that. I see. That's good, she said. She stared to the side for a few seconds, considering something, before refocusing back on him. So did you at least get any good abilities out of the whole thing? I'm not sure, Zorian said evasively. I'm still not sure what exactly the newest addition to my soul is or what it does. Really? She frowned. But didn't you say you learned how to sense your soul? Yes, so? So why don't you just focus on the spliced part for a while and try to figure out what it is? That sounds important to know. I know you probably want to forget about whatever happened to you, but as a shifter I can tell you it's very unhealthy to ignore parts of your soul because they won't ignore you. Hold on, how would I sense a part of my soul? Zorian frowned. That wasn't a part of the lesson I received from the priest. Rainey opened her mouth to say something before quickly closing it. She stayed silent for a while, considering something. "You know," she finally said, "I'm not sure whether anyone other than shifters would even want to sense specific parts of their soul. No need, probably. Unless they intend to modify it somehow, and that's usually a bad idea. And also not something a priest would do, unless they're a very heretical priest. So your teacher probably didn't even know that it could be done." "Oh," Zorian said lamely. "Do you want me to teach you how to do it?" Rainey asked. "What?" asked Zorian. "Really? Aren't shifters very secretive about their magic?" "No," Rainey said uncertainly. "Not about stuff like this, anyway. This is simple stuff. Every shifter learns how to do this as a child. They have to if they want to make use of their abilities properly. I can't see any harm in teaching you how to do it if you're willing, and I kind of feel like I owe you for all the help you've given me during the practice sessions you organized." Huh? Something good came out of the time sink? This restart was just full of surprises. "Well, I'm willing," he shrugged. "Name the time and the place." He didn't have much hope that a technique designed to sense a part of your soul would give him anything particularly substantial about his soul marker, but it didn't hurt to try and see if it led to something. At the very least, Rainey implied it was a simple thing to learn, so it shouldn't become another thing vying for his time. Break. As it turned out, the method for sensing parts of your soul turned out to be rather simple when someone actually pointed it out to you. Well, provided one had already gone through the trouble of developing a personal soul sense beforehand. The results he got when he used it to inspect his soul were better than he hoped. He actually could sense his marker and the way it was woven into his soul, but unlike shifters, he didn't get any instinctive understanding of its function and how to use it if it could be actually used by the one it was stamped on. Which made sense, considering it was not actually a part of his soul in the way a shifter's alternate form was. Rainey herself seemed unfazed by the partial failure and told him to keep trying for a while. It usually took months for shifters to fully map out the way different parts of their soul interacted with one another, and while she doubted his case made him as complex as a shifter, she felt it was too early to give up after a single day or two. Fair enough. He supposed he could set aside an hour or two every weekend and see if it led anywhere. In the meantime, the day of the summer festival approached and Zorian became consumed with preparations for the end of the restart. This time, he had something a bit more ambitious he wanted to try out. He was going to try and infiltrate the Ebeson main base during the invasion and pass through the dimensional gate to see where it led. And then, hopefully, find someone new and more interesting to interrogate on the other side. Chapter 046 The Other Side. "I'm ready," Zorian said. "You can start casting whenever you want." Eston, his current practice partner, gave him a solemn nod and started launching magic missiles at him in quick succession. Zorian calmly intercepted them all with his shield, dividing his attention between watching the way Eston was casting the spell so he could help him improve it afterwards and trying to work out the absolute minimum shield strength he could get away with to safely tank the attacks. A bad idea usually, if this had been a real spar, like the ones he had been having with Taven recently. Being as cheap as possible with his counters would be a recipe for disaster. But well, his practice group had pretty much given up on those when he was involved. He was too good and didn't know how to hold back properly, so these days he mostly served as a living target and dispenser of advice. Not that this made him useless to the group, far from it, but it did mean he had to get creative to get some personal benefit from attending these practice sessions. After 14 magic missiles, Eston stopped casting and they switched positions, with Eston defending himself and Zorian attacking. The former Ebeson was the only person in the training group who could really tank one of his magic missiles at maximum power, so there was no need for Zorian to hold back. The floating earth spheres Eston used as shields were far more resilient than he initially gave them credit for, soaking up his magic missiles with ease. No matter what he tried, he could not even shatter one, much less punch through them. It was an interesting challenge. He had largely reached a plateau in terms of magic missile strength. Like all spells, Magic Missile had a limited amount of mana it could be supercharged with, and Zorian was at the point where he simply couldn't cram in more mana without hopelessly destabilizing the spell boundary. That was a shame, as Magic Missile was his most energy-efficient combat spell, thanks to the amount of practice he put into it. In fact, the spell was so mana efficient at this point that it was playing merry hell with his ability to judge how far his mana reserves had grown. He could cast about 35 of them in quick succession, which was more than 4 times the amount he could cast before the time loop. That shouldn't be possible, especially since he was sure his mana reserves still hadn't topped out yet, so the most logical conclusion was that his magic missiles required significantly less mana now than they had in the past. The magnitude system probably wasn't designed with people like him in mind. He doubted a lot of people practiced magic missile as doggedly as he did. And yet, for all the refinement his magic missile now had, he knew from Chiron that he still hadn't reached the pinnacle of the spell. A properly executed magic missile would be totally invisible. Which his magic missiles weren't. He had an idea about that, though. No one in the practice group other than Eston could reliably tank one of his magic missiles without their shields giving way. Even his normal missiles often proved too much for them, never mind if he really powered them up. As a consequence, he had been forced to learn how to adjust his attacks downwards to something they could deal with. He quickly found that trying to purposely weaken his missiles was pretty hard. Strategically sabotaging the spell boundary to make the spell less mana efficient was inelegant and offended his professional pride, but trying to make Magic Missile technically perfect yet functionally weaker was not as easy as it appeared at first glance. His reflexes, honed over the years spent in the time loop, and even the very construction of the spell itself naturally tended towards a certain optimum effect. Going against it was a constant struggle. Still, he had gotten the hang of the ability to dial down the missile's power after a few days, and had discovered that when he dialed the power low enough, he could get the shine and opacity to drop like a stone. At the very lowest point, he could produce missiles that were nothing but a faint warp in the air, and sadly, about as effective on anything they hit. Still, practicing the spell at these lower power levels made it easier to see the faults and imperfections he made in the spell boundary, and fixing those immediately led to a small but noticeable increase in his mana efficiency when casting his normal version of Magic Missile. He had a feeling this was the secret to effectively developing proper invisible force spells. Don't start by making normal versions invisible, instead reduce the power and work on making a weaker version more technically perfect and mana efficient. Then steadily work your way up until you end up with a flawlessly executed, fully powered version. None of the books he'd found actually outlined this method as a possible training regimen, instead suggesting endless repetition of the spell as a method, but Zorian felt his idea had merit. He had little to lose by trying it, since the officially suggested training method consisted of mindlessly practicing the normal version for years and even decades at a time. Yes, he was stuck in a time loop, but there had to be a better method than that. After he'd failed to get through Eston's Earth defense, he called for a brief pause to let everyone replenish their mana reserves. He personally didn't need the break. He was purposely using only a small fraction of his reserves during these practice sessions, and he had already honed his ability to assimilate ambient mana as far as it could go, so it generally took him only a few minutes to go back to his top form. The others needed to catch their breath, however, and he had to be mindful of that. If nothing else, he was learning the limitations of people around his age. He had honestly forgotten what it was like to be on their level, and had trouble judging what people his age found challenging or even downright impossible. Hopefully this experience would make him better equipped to pretend he was a normal student in the future, or at least more aware of what would attract people's attention and to what extent. The break was eventually interrupted when Edwin marched into the gathering, the latest golem they'd made following after him. "Hey Edwin," Name greeted. "What brings you here? Finally decided to join us?" "Huh? No, I'm here because of this," he said, grasping the little golem by its shoulders and proudly pushing it forward so the group could take a look at it. The construct was pretty impressive, even if Zorian was a little biased in thinking that. Being little less than a meter tall, the golem did not look particularly intimidating, but he doubted anyone would mistake it for a harmless toy. Its slender, humanoid figure was made out of alchemically treated steel and powered by a comparatively massive crystallized mono battery that supplied it with plenty of power. Its movements were smooth and natural, and despite Edwin's rough handling, it never lost its balance like Zorian's previous golems would have. The golem looked and moved like a credible little helper and last-ditch defender distraction. They did a good job of making it, Zorian felt. Enlisting Edwin to help with his golem making had definitely been the right decision. Neat, Name shrugged. That's what you and Zorian have been working on all this time, isn't it? What about it? Yes, Zorian agreed. The last time they met, he left the golem with Edwin so the other boy could run a bunch of tests to see if it worked properly. Did Edwin find some critical flaw in the construct or did he just come to brag about their success? Is there something wrong with it? It? Edwin asked with faux outrage. His name is Chelik, and he's absolutely perfect. I mean, just look at him. Everyone, meet Chelik. Chelik, say hi to the nice folks gathered here. The golem quietly gave a brief wave before letting its metallic hand unceremoniously drop again. Yeah, apparently Edwin just wanted to brag. Zorian caught Estin and Capriva rolling their eyes at the spectacle, while Brahm and Rainey seemed honestly impressed by the little golem. Name just continued smiling serenely, and Zorian couldn't tell whether Name was honestly happy for his friend or just humoring the guy. Unfortunately, there was one part of him that I just couldn't test properly, Edwin said. We warded this little beauty with every defensive ward we could manage. Well, Zorian did, I just kind of watched and took notes. But never mind that, the point is that Chelik here should be able to shrug off a lot of damage and disruptive spells and... You want us to try and damage it, Estin surmised. Yes, Edwin agreed with a grin. I'll just move aside and then you can all just attack it together. All of us? Rainey asked curiously. Yeah, Edwin nodded. He's really tough, so don't worry about overkill. I don't think any of you can really do anything to it individually. Estin frowned, clearly taking it as a challenge, before putting one of his palms on the ground in front of him. For a second, nothing happened. And then, without any warning, the ground beneath Chelik opened up like a set of earthen jaws and pulled it into the resulting hole before snapping shut. The poor golem was left with most of its body trapped under the soil, with only its head sticking free. Edwin stared at the buried golem for a second before glancing uncertainly towards Estin. The other boy inclined his head to the side, smiling faintly, clearly very pleased with himself. Okay. Claim as proven, Edwin chuckled awkwardly. Could you please unbury him so we can move on to further testing? Eventually, they did try to bring down the little golem with a collective magic missile barrage and predictably failed. Even Zorian's missiles did not damage Chelik in any way, though hitting the limbs and head could imbalance it and knock it to the ground. Estin tried to hammer it into scrap with one of his earth spheres, but only succeeded in knocking it to the ground and rendering it immobile so long as the sphere was pressing down on it. Capriva chucked a vial of alchemical acid at it, but this didn't work either. Finally, Brian went ahead and summoned his familiar and had the juvenile fire drake breathe fire at the golem for a while. That at least had some effect, in the sense that the golem ended up visibly heating up as a result. The fire wards weren't able to deal with sustained fire magic, it seemed. Edwin terminated the testing at this point, not wanting to see Chelik actually destroyed. A satisfactory result, all things considered. The vulnerability to being buried and otherwise restrained was a large and obvious weakness, though, and Zorian was already considering what he could do to overcome it when making golems in the future. The end of Edwin's golem test ultimately also signaled the end of the current practice session as well, and most people excused themselves and left afterwards. The summer festival was only a few days away, so this was basically the last training session he would have with the practice group. That fact left him strangely sad. He had originally resented the loss of free time that came with the meetings, but the classmates he taught had ended up growing on him a little. It was nice to have someone actually respect his skills and achievements for a change, instead of constantly reminding him about how inadequate he was and how far he still had to go. He turned towards Rainey, the last person to remain at the training ground with him. She didn't look like she intended to excuse herself, so he assumed she wanted to talk to him. "Yes?" he asked. "Did you find out anything about your extra soul bits?" she asked. She was stalling for time, but whatever. No reason not to answer the question. "Sort of," he said. "I found a few ways to interact with it, but I only know what one of them actually does. Or at least I think I do. I'll try it out soon to make sure." Yes, it was rather surprising, but apparently the marker actually was designed to be interacted with by its bearer. There were multiple switches, for lack of a better word, that were clearly meant to do something once they were activated. A good number of them were utterly inert, and did not react at all to his probing, either because he did not know how to interact with them properly or because they were broken in the marker's transfer from Zack to Zorian. A lot of them were perfectly functional, however, and readily responded to his probes, eager to be set off like exuberant little puppies. He shied away from actually experimenting with them, since they gave absolutely no indication what their function was. All except one. There was one command switch that immediately gave him a vague impression of what it was meant to do when he tried mucking around with it. He planned to test that one at the conclusion of his portal infiltration attempt. "Make sure to have someone watching over you when you do that," Rainey cautioned. "At the very least they can call for help if you collapse or something." "I will," Zorian lied. "Now why don't you tell me what's really bothering you?" "It's nothing you can really help me with," she sighed. "I just feel like complaining to someone, I guess. I have no one here to confide to, except for Kiana. My fault, really. I didn't try very hard to make any other friends. I don't want to bother Kiana about this again, so." "Well, feel free to complain," Zorian told her. "Is this about your family, perhaps?" "Yes," she confirmed. "I sent them a letter last week. Asked them if I could come home for the summer festival. They said I wasn't welcome." "Well, not really in those words, but I can read between the lines." "Harsh. What did she do to deserve that kind of response?" "Well, Rainey did say she wanted to complain, so he would probably find out soon." He opted to stay quiet and let her talk. After a moment of quiet while she collected her thoughts, she started her story. "The leadership of my tribe is hereditary," she said. "The firstborn son of the current chief inherits the mantle of leadership from his father. Simple enough, but the problem was that my father didn't have a son. My mother had a hard pregnancy when she bore me, and the tribe refused to bring outside healers to help. After I was born, she could conceive no further children. Or at least that's what we all thought for a time. Regardless, it was decided that in the absence of a male heir, even a daughter would do. Nobody wanted a succession crisis. So the tribe accepted a female leader but wasn't too happy with it. Considering the hypothetical scenario she'd asked him about earlier in the restart, he had a feeling he knew where this was going. As I grew up, I was constantly told I had to be strong for the tribe, Rainey said. That I have to work hard and embody the ideals we represented, so that there could be no question as to whether I deserved my position. I never resented that. I was proud of my tribesmen and my parents, for putting so much faith in me. I did my best, and I was good at it. Good enough that, in time, even my staunchest critics had fallen silent. But then Mother got pregnant again. Zorian winced internally. It was a son, wasn't it? 9 months later, Mother gave birth to the baby boy that my father had always wanted, she said bitterly, confirming his suspicion. I wasn't sidelined immediately, of course. They had to make sure my brother was not defective in some way before doing something so rash. I had hoped for a time that I might succeed in keeping the mantle through superior skill and effort, but of course he ended up being a blasted prodigy. It was clear that he would eventually eclipse me. I did not take it very well. I did not step down from my position quietly, and some of the tribe members even supported me. Mostly because they felt I had proven myself capable while my brother was still a relative unknown, and the designated heir had never been stripped of their position like that, so the whole thing was a bit questionable. But ultimately, my worst enemy was my own father. I had thought he was proud of me, of all I had accomplished, but in the end he was the one arguing most vehemently that I should move aside so my brother can take the mantle. How could I have possibly won that battle when my own father stood against me? So they don't want you back because they think you're a threat to your brother's legitimacy and the tribe's leader? Zorian spoke out. I am a threat to his legitimacy, Rainey said. Was. I don't know. I'm not really sure about anything anymore. I feel like nothing I did mattered in the end. What do I even have to live for, now? All my life I was taught to live for the tribe, but I'm not sure I even want to go back there when they finally deign to let me return. What is there waiting for me? I don't think I'll ever be happy living back there. Zorian studied her for a moment, wondering if he should try and comfort her. She seemed more angry than sad, though, and he had a feeling she wouldn't appreciate such a gesture. Best not to risk it. So your being here is your exile, then? He asked. Pretty much, she answered. Me being here allows them to cement my brother's position without my interference. Plus, me being educated by outsiders and taught outsider magic destroys whatever shreds of legitimacy I had left. I can't understand why they won't let you home for the summer festival, then, Zorian said. Not that I understand why you'd even want to go back to your father and brother you clearly can't stand, but that's beside the point. The point is that if you've been outmaneuvered that thoroughly, surely there is no harm in letting you go back home for a few days. That seems very petty of them. I was a bit of a bitch to my brother the last time I was home, she admitted. I guess the little shit went crying to our parents, because they've been keeping him away from me ever since. They seem to think there is a risk of me killing him. So insulting. They kept talking for a while. Well, Rainey kept talking. He mostly just listened, but eventually she ran out of steam and just fell quiet for a time before announcing it was late and that she should go. Before she left, however, she told him that she enjoyed their meetings and asked if they could continue meeting like that, even if his original purpose for approaching her had long been fulfilled at this point. He agreed. Of course he did. And despite her stoic demeanor, he could tell she was very happy to hear that. But the summer festival was just around the corner and she would soon forget any of this ever happened. The next time they met, they would be virtual strangers to each other. He decided not to befriend Rainey again in the future. Not while the time loop was still in effect, anyway. If he ever managed to get out, though, he told himself that he would try to befriend the red-headed shifter for real. She reminded him of his pre-time loop self too much to just ignore it. Her problem was, as she said, something he couldn't really help her with. But maybe just having an extra friend would be enough. He remained at the training ground for quite some time afterwards, lost in thought, before making his way back to Amaya's place. Break. It was the day before the summer festival and everything was ready. He had stopped Nachka's kidnapping again, crafted all of the equipment he would be using in his gate-crashing attempt, and evacuated the filigree sages back to their home. Now all that was left was to gather the findings Kale and Tivan had made with their personal research and store them inside his mind for future restarts. Fortunately, he was currently meeting them both in Amaya's basement for exactly that purpose. Here, Taven said, handing him a small notebook. I can't believe I'm saying this, but I'm kind of glad the month is coming to a close. You have no idea how annoying it is to practice shaping exercises all day, every day. Taven, I've had Xvim as my mentor for the past 4 years, Zorian pointed out. Yeah. She waved dismissively. Show me what you've learned, he told her. What? But it's all written down there, she protested, pointing at the notebook in his hands. Doesn't matter, I want to see it personally, he insisted. Some things really cannot be written down. She had progressed nicely, he decided 15 minutes later. Some things he considered trivial didn't really work out, which meant he either wasn't teaching them properly or Tivan was spectacularly unsuited for them, but there were also some exercises that came almost naturally to her. It was a good start, if nothing else. That was way too slow, he said. And you fumbled a bit towards the end. If you say start over one more time, Zorian. Taven warned him. Fine, I'll stop channeling my inner Xvim, He chuckled. We'll stop here. I got what I needed, I think. Kale, how about you? Are my eyes deceiving me, or has the amount of notebooks you got for me actually shrunk from what it was initially? You said you memorize how the whole book is made with that spell of yours, not just text, so I figured I would write as dense as possible and save space that way. A single book takes the same amount of space in your memory regardless of how much is written in it, if I understood you correctly, Kale said. That's true, but the alteration pattern I store is never flawless, so some imperfections are bound to creep up in the reproduction. I hope you didn't make the letters too small. Some quick testing proved that Kale's condensed writing survived the memorization reproduction process just fine, so Zorian went ahead and memorized the whole stack. Well, that's it, I guess, Taven said awkwardly. I guess we'll see each other in the next restart. Not that I'll remember any of it. Actually, I'm going to skip going to see Oria for a couple of restarts, Zorian admitted. I need to find a way to halt, or at least delay the degradation of the matriarch's memory package. And also to advance my memory reading skills so I can get something out of it if I fail. I can't waste time on classes before I solve this. Fair enough, Kale said. I'll note that I have pretty much exhausted all the low-lying fruits when it comes to my research. I'll need to reach out to other experts and maybe acquire some restricted materials through less than legal channels the next time we do this. I know you're justifiably leery of making too many waves, so you'll have to discuss this with my other self. Just as well that he was putting his routine and Siorio on temporary hold, then. He didn't need a distraction like that right now. The group separated after a while, with Zorian leaving to find Kirill. There was one last thing he wanted to do before the end. Kiri, do you think you could show me your drawings? He asked. She didn't need much convincing. She ran out of the room and soon returned with a thick stack of papers that represented her artistic endeavor over the course of the past month. She drew anything that caught her fancy, it seemed, the sparrows that liked to gather on the street in front of Imaya's house, the house they lived in and its inhabitants, the trees in the nearby park where she played with Nochka, and so on. He was especially impressed with the handful of images that depicted Siorio's main train station. Not only did she remember what all the various storefronts they'd visited looked like, she even memorized many of the individual items that had been on sale. Zorian had forgotten most of that stuff roughly 5 minutes after they had left the train station, but Kirill had remembered it well enough to draw a realistic picture of it an entire day afterwards. If he ever found some time to kill, he should ask Kirill to teach him how to draw. He doubted he would be any good at it, but the mental image of his little sister trying to teach him something was amusing. And this one is Nochka's kitty foer, Kirill fumbled, barely catching herself in time. She threw him a panicked look and then tried to shove the drawing of the young black cat beneath some of the already inspected drawings. Heh? Her kitty form, perhaps? Zorian asked innocently. You knew. Kirill gasped. I knew, he confirmed. So could you tell she's a shifter on your own, or is she simply as bad at keeping secrets as you are? I'm not bad at keeping secrets. She protested. And, she kind of slipped that she can do magic and I bugged her until she showed me what she can do. Ah yes, the eternal tendency of people to brag about their skills. Well, that and Kirill's incredible ability to keep bringing the subject up until the victim decides it's easier to just give in and humor her. He didn't blame Nochka for giving in, considering how often he ended up doing the same. Nochka's indiscretion aside, there were no further surprises waiting for him among Kirill's drawings. He then tried to cast the memorization spell to commit the entire stack to his memory, but found that Kirill was intensely protective of her work and strangely suspicious of his actions. It took a while for Zorian to convince Kirill that the spell he wanted to cast was totally non-destructive and that he wouldn't even dream of burning her artwork or anything similar. Really, where did she even get the idea? Furtov once burned a bunch of my drawings when I asked him to show me some magic, she admitted. Said it was a joke. Zorian rolled his eyes. Yes, that sounded about right for Furtov. Knowing Kirill, she was probably being extremely annoying and disruptive. but that was still a very shitty thing to do. I'm kind of insulted you'd compare me to Fertov, but whatever, Zorian said. He quickly memorized the stack and handed it back to her. There. All done. Kirill quickly leafed through the papers to make sure he really hadn't done any damage and then left to put the drawings back to her room. She was back soon enough, though, looking worried. Zorian, why did you want to memorize my drawings? She asked. You could just ask me to show them to you whenever you wanted to take a look. Are you going somewhere? Zorian gave her a sideways glance, wondering what to tell her. He would be leaving her behind during the next few restarts, and he kind of felt guilty about it, but there was no helping it. It was why he was wasting some of his mental space on her drawings instead of filling it out with something more practical. She was pretty observant to have come to that conclusion, though. She probably noticed some of his other preparations. Yes, he admitted. I am. After the summer festival. Oh, she said. But don't you have to attend classes? Well, yes. But this is more important, he said. Don't worry, I won't be gone long. You won't even notice I'm gone. Surprisingly, she accepted this explanation without complaints. Good. The last thing he needed was for her to freak out this close to the end. But, she decided, you have to bring me a gift when you come back. Or I'm telling Mom you left me alone with a bunch of strangers. Sure, said Zorian, rolling his eyes. He wondered if gifting her with the drawings she'd drawn herself in previous restarts counted as cheating. Probably. But he was going to do it anyway, just to see how she reacted. Break. The dimensional gate beneath Sioria was a difficult target to approach. One had to avoid numerous Ebeson patrol groups to even get near it, and then the prospective attacker had to deal with an entire defensive base built around the gate if they wanted to actually pass through. Storming such a place was a task for a battle group, not a single mage, and would give the defenders plenty of time to shut down the gate if they felt the base was about to fall. Not to mention that Kutachicholkadan probably would come to their aid if such a major assault was launched on the place. No, the only viable way of accessing the gate was to sneak in somehow. A rather unlikely endeavor, considering the place was teeming with mages and war trolls, and likely had plenty of detection wards layered on top of it too. But Zorian had a plan. A rather reckless plan that he'd never even think about trying outside of the time loop. But it was a plan regardless. At its core, it rested on the assumption that the Ebesons would send almost everyone they had to participate in the invasion proper, leaving only a handful of defenders to guard the gate. Thus, the best time to make the attempt was when the invasion had already begun. If the Ebesons were smart and cautious, that wouldn't be true and his plan would be over before it even began. If they were really smart and cautious, the gate would be shut down the moment the invasion began and all of his plotting would have been for nothing. But Zorian was willing to bet that the Ebesons needed all the manpower they could get for the fighting on the surface, and that the leadership needed the gate functioning so they could retreat safely to their island. There was a lot of sea between Eldamar and Alquanabasa. He was hoping they would just leave behind a skeleton crew at the base, with orders to summon Kutachichel if they get into more trouble than they can handle. Thus, when the day of the invasion had finally come, Zorian immediately descended deep into the tunnel system beneath Sioria and started looking for some nasty critters to dominate. Something strong enough to cause a distraction, but weak enough that the defenders wouldn't panic when it started throwing itself on the base defenses. Just a random monster attack that would distract everyone and give Zorian a chance to slip inside unnoticed. It took him some time, but he eventually found a pack of hook goblins, small, flightless, bat-like humanoids whose front limbs sported huge, hook-like claws. Highly dangerous up close but easily killable. A threat but not that much of a threat. Perfect. Then he waited. As time went by, his prediction of Ebesons withdrawing virtually everyone to participate in the invasion gradually came to pass. The Ebesons were indeed withdrawing nearly all patrol groups around their base, allowing Zorian to finally approach the place and lay his eyes on the center of Ebeson invasion. Well, he already knew its basic layout from the memories extracted from the captured Ebesons, but that wasn't the same as seeing it firsthand. The base was situated in a massive cavern, and was quite large. It was practically a small town, which was not very surprising considering the amount of forces the Ebusons normally kept here. In the center of the settlement stood a handful of stone buildings that were probably raised from the cavern floor via alteration. The gate was in the middle of this section, serving as the heart of the settlement. Surrounding the fancy stone buildings was a ramshackle collection of tents and pens where the peons and war trolls lived. There were no walls around the settlement, but each of the tunnels connecting to the cavern had a checkpoint that served as a first line of defense. Zorian waited for a while for the numbers to thin out further, and when they remained static for a while, mentally pushed the hook goblins to attack one of the checkpoints, doing his best to boost their bloodthirstiness and suppress their fear. He didn't have to do much, honestly. Hook goblins seemed to be almost perpetually angry creatures, going utterly berserk at even the slightest provocation. They fell upon the checkpoint, screeching and clawing, and the base immediately went into an uproar. Zorian's original idea was to use the distraction to attack one of the other checkpoints while everyone else was distracted, but that turned out to be unnecessary. When he reached his chosen target, he found out that its guards were unprofessional enough to leave their posts to help out their buddies against the hook goblins. Or maybe the base was even more short on manpower than he originally suspected. No matter, he decided to simply take advantage of the situation and waltzed in. He made it all the way to the gate without being stopped, or even confronted by anyone. At one point he crossed paths with a mage running towards the battle site, but it only took a weak suggestion from Zorian that he was completely normal, nothing to see here, and the man promptly put him out of his mind and kept running. He honestly didn't expect it to be that easy. Unfortunately, when he reached the dimensional gate itself, he found that it had its own guards and that they refused to leave their posts, despite the commotion. 4 mages and 2 trolls. He could deal with them perhaps, but he didn't think he could do it without raising a ruckus. Shame. He was just about to throw caution to the wind and start chucking around fireballs and explosive cubes everywhere, when one of the other defenders came running and started shouting at the mages around the gate. The hook goblins had broken through the checkpoint and the newcomer wanted them to signal Quatachachol to come and save them. Oops. He honestly didn't think his little minions would end up winning. It seemed that not only did the Ebusons leave a skeleton crew to hold the base, said skeleton crew was composed out of the dregs of their force. No wonder this infiltration was so easy. Fortunately for Zorian, no summoning of Quatachachol would take place. The mages guarding seemed horrified at the very idea. Their leader ranted for an entire minute about how the ancient lich would have them all flayed alive if they summoned him to deal with a bunch of stinking hook goblins, and eventually sent 2 of his fellow guards and both of the war trolls to contain the incursion. Zorian could only watch incredulously as the gate was suddenly left with only 2 mages to guard it. Well, that certainly made things easier. He waited for a while for the other Ebusons to get some distance away from the gate and then chucked a vial of sleeping gas at the 2 remaining guards from his hiding place. One of them, the one that spoke to the panicked defender and seemed to be their leader, managed to stumble out of the cloud in a semi-lucid state and promptly received a piercer in the head for his troubles. The other collapsed into sleep, as intended, and Zorian blew the cloud away with a gust of wind before hurriedly approaching the dimensional gate they were guarding. Zorian itched to examine the thing in greater detail, but no, this wasn't the time for that. The current priority was to find out what was on the other side. Looking through the opening itself, he could see that the gate led to an empty, spacious room devoid of further guards. Which was rather weird. Were the Ebusons really leaving one end of the gate undefended? He tried extending his mind sense through the dimensional opening and was pleased to note that the gate was no barrier to his mind sense. And even gladder that he could detect no hidden enemies. Suspicious, but mindful of the limited amount of time he had, he took a deep breath and stepped through the gate. He felt a tendril of magic brush against his soul protections the moment his foot touched the floor of the destination room, trying to identify him. It recoiled from his spiritual defense, and Zorian immediately felt the atmosphere in the room change, becoming heavier and more foreboding. He had been detected by the wards and labeled as an intruder. Behind him, the edges of the dimensional opening started crackling with lightning. The gate then began rapidly shrinking and soon winked out of existence entirely in a soft flash of light. Break. Though the closing of the portal had taken him off guard, Zorian was ultimately unconcerned about its disappearance. He was already through, after all, and at least this way the Ebeson forces on the other end of the gate wouldn't be able to pursue him. He quickly looked around and confirmed that the room was indeed empty, aside from the now inactive stone icosahedron erected in the center of it. There was only one door in sight, and Zorian immediately blasted it to splinters rather than open it normally. No need to risk getting hit with some hostile ward effect because he was dumb enough to grasp the handle. Quickly leaving the gate room, he started exploring the place, trying to find out as much as he could before the Ebeson forces on this side of the gate, alerted by the wards, came running to deal with him. Except that there were no Ebeson forces. And he wasn't in some hastily erected base, either. He quickly found out that the gate had been situated in a basement of a pretty luxurious mansion. A very large, seemingly abandoned mansion. Zorian was confused at first. The first gate in the chain was supposed to lead to some isolated place in the Sarakian Highlands after all, so he kind of expected a wilderness camp surrounded by trees. Then the defenders of the place finally tracked him down, and he understood where he was. The undead boar that just tried to bite his leg off was exactly like the ones that assaulted Le Cave every restart. He was in the Sarakian Highlands. Specifically, he was in Iasqua Mansion. And the place was apparently teeming with undead. He frantically dodged a knife thrust by his assailant, a silent, knife-wielding man wrapped in concealing black clothes. Zorian had shot him through his head with a piercer earlier, but that didn't seem to bother him too much. Another black-clad, knife-wielding corpse advanced at him from the left, and the blasted boar looked like it was readying for another charge. Zorian threw a glowing cylinder on the ground in front of him, causing a disruptive, dispelling pulse to wash over everything around him. The three corpses attacking him collapsed lifelessly to the ground, the pulse having destroyed the magic that kept their animating souls bound to their bodies. Zorian sighed. That was the third dispeller grenade he had been forced to use since coming to this place. He had only ever had 5 of them to start with, not having expected to fight hordes of undead today. Most of his other single-use items were gone as well. He knew this mission was likely to result in his violent death, but this was still kind of annoying. And also more than a little dangerous. The presence of so much undead meant there were necromancers inside. It might actually be dangerous to die here. He was just about to go back to the gate room and barricade himself there when a living person entered his mind's sense, heading straight for him. Well, crap. That was the necromancer, wasn't it? Of course it was. That must be why the undead backed off after that last attack. He quickly scattered his remaining explosive cubes on the floor in front of him and retreated deeper into the corridor. Then the door on the other end of the corridor opened and a tall, muscular man with a huge mustache stepped into the corridor. He took one look at Zorian and smiled jovially, like seeing an old friend who he hadn't heard from in years. "Welcome," he said. "I am Sadamir Kondre, the owner of this humble abode. May I ask why you have invaded my home?" "I don't know what you're talking about," said Zorian, taking a step back. Step deeper into the corridor, step deeper into the corridor. The door was quite open, all I had to do was step through the gate. If you didn't want anyone coming through, surely you wouldn't have left that thing so unprotected. Why, I bet a whole army could just waltz through this place if you weren't careful. Zorian took another step back. Sadamir followed him, taking a step deeper into the corridor. Now, Zorian sent a pulse of mana to the explosive cubes, triggering them and sending the entire corridor into a... No, actually nothing happened at all. What the hell? Wards. Wonderful things, aren't they? Sadamir smiled. I can't have things exploding in my own home, you see. And besides, even if you did catch me in that trap, that wouldn't have killed me. I assure you I am quite hard to kill. Lovely. Zorian stared at the man in front of him for a second and then concentrated on his marker for a second. What are you doing? Sadamir asked harshly. He could probably see that he was doing something with his soul. Damn necromancers and their cheating soul sight. Zorian ignored him and ordered one of the slots of the marker, the one that actually gave him an impression of what it was supposed to do, to activate. His vision immediately turned dark and then he woke up back in Surin, Kirill wishing him a good morning. He sighed in relief, confusing Kirill. Thank the gods that worked. Tob continued.